The Denver Broncos. Oh boy, this team has been a train wreck for the last few seasons, haven't they? Well, now that they've completely gone off the edge and are almost out of the playoffs, it's time to dissect the price that they paid for their victory in Super Bowl 50 over the Panthers. From them botching the whole quarterback and head coach situation to now becoming the most toxic team I have ever seen in the NFL, it is just a complete mess in Denver, so let's just go ahead and dive into this, shall we? But before we do, don't forget to let me know in the comments down below how you would fix the mess in Denver. Also, don't forget to consider liking and subscribing because it does help out the channel a whole lot. Also, all sources that I use and all video that will be shown will be linked down in the description below and referenced on screen as it is applicable. I think it's best that we start by winding the clock all the way back to the year 2015. The Denver Broncos were looking to compete once again with Peyton Manning under center. Their offense also was loaded with the likes of Emmanuel Sanders and Demaryius Thomas as targets for Manning to throw to. Things were also loaded on the defensive side of the ball with players like Aqib Talib, Shaq Barrett, and oh yeah, that one guy, he wasn't well known. His name was only Von Miller. Expectations were relatively high, with the team expected to be 9-7, which would have likely been enough to, at the start of the season, to make the playoffs for them. That being said, this team started out white hot. They went on to win their first 7 games of the season, with some of them being some pretty substantial teams, like the Minnesota Vikings, who went on to win the NFC North that year, the Green Bay Packers, who were still fighting with Rodgers, and the Kansas City Chiefs, who were always a bit of a pest back in the 2010s in the AFC. Sitting at 7-0, they went on a small little skid, losing their next 2 to the Colts and Chiefs, but they went on to win 5 of their last 7 to finish the season at 12-4, 3 wins over their expected value. These wins also came against some good teams like the likes of Tom Brady and the Patriots and the Cincinnati Bengals, who were pretty solid that year as well. That being said, they had a relatively soft schedule, but they did well with it. They did so well, in fact, they got the #1 seed in the AFC. In the playoffs, this team would face the 10-6 Pittsburgh Steelers. This game was a close back-and-forth affair, in which it was a fun watch, but the Broncos would end up beating them with a solid 23-16 win, avenging their 34-27 loss to the Steelers earlier in the season, which would advance them into the AFC Championship game. After this game, they would move on to face the 12-4 New England Patriots, who were always a tough play in the playoffs. The last time these teams had met, the Broncos had won in overtime by a final score of 30-24, so this game was due to be a treat. This game was yet another back-and-forth game, but it was lower scoring than their last meeting. The game ended with a final score of a 20-18 Broncos win, and this sent them right into Super Bowl 50 against the white-hot Carolina Panthers, who were destroying everyone they met. The Carolina Panthers were fresh off a 15-1 regular season and beating the Seattle Seahawks 31-24 and the Arizona Cardinals 49-15 in the playoffs. This team was led by a 4th-year Cam Newton and had some other studs on their roster like Greg Olsen, Luke Kuechly, and Josh Norman. This means that Super Bowl 50 was set to be great. And it was maybe. This game was dominated by Denver, but Carolina was always in it. The Broncos never put Carolina away until a late Denver touchdown to seal the game. The only downside of the Super Bowl win for Denver? It would mean the end of the Denver Broncos for at least a decade. After the Super Bowl 50 win, legendary quarterback Peyton Manning retired, and it sent the Broncos down a long spiral of various quarterbacks and head coaches. Once Manning retired, the Broncos turned to their second-year player Trevor Siemian, who was only a 7th-round pick, picked 250th overall, so on the outside, hope was minimal for the Broncos, but they rode with him nonetheless. There were a few bright spots with Siemian under center, like in Week 2 against the Colts, where he threw for 215 yards in the first half, and again in Week 3, where he threw for 312 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions against the Bengals. He also had a great game against the Chiefs in Week 11, throwing for 368 yards and 3 touchdowns to 0 interceptions. But despite the highlights, in his first season as the starter, he went 289 for 486. Completion percentage was 59.47%, throwing for only 3,400 yards, 18 touchdowns, and 10 interceptions, which is a bit high than what you would want. The season was overall alright, and it might have been something to build off of, but the Broncos at 9-7 came up short once again to miss the playoffs, and their head coach, Gary Kubiak, stepped down at the end of the season. From there, the Broncos hired their Dolphins defensive coordinator, Vance Joseph, as their new head coach. In his first season as head coach, he started Trevor Siemian once again, but after Siemian had a rough stretch and the Broncos fell to 3-4, Vance Joseph benched Siemian for Brock Osweiler, but after injuries, Siemian did get the nod for the starting nod for 3 games in weeks 13 to 15, where he really didn't play well, and he suffered a season-ending injury in week 15. Siemian ended up playing in 11 games and had a completion percentage of 59.03%, 2,285 yards, 12 touchdowns, and 14 interceptions. This disastrous season for Siemian would signal the end of his run as the Broncos starting quarterback, especially since they ended this season with a 5-11 record, even worse than the year before. After deciding to move on from Siemian, Vance Joseph and the Broncos turned to the undrafted career journeyman Case Keenum to lead them to the promised land. Keenum had just come off a season for the Minnesota Vikings where he played in all 16 games, and he boasted a 67.57% completion percentage with 3,547 yards, 22 touchdowns, and 7 interceptions. This move looked to be huge for the Broncos as they thought they had their franchise quarterback in Keenum. So how did he fare in the 2018 season for the Broncos? Well, he played at a solid level. He had a 62.29 completion percentage, throwing for 2,890 yards and 18 touchdowns to 15 interceptions in 16 games. The numbers weren't too bad, but the touchdown to interception ratio was a bit high and a bit higher than desired. That being said, the team as a whole did not play well at all, ending with a 6-10 record, so it was time for a change. This change included firing Vance Joseph and trading Case Keenum. This move was not a great move as they only got a 6th round pick from Washington for a guy who could have been their next quarterback of the Broncos, or at least a solid bridge quarterback for the next guy that they would draft. This being the first of many bad moves at the top. The first order of business of this offseason was to find a new head coach. The Broncos searched high and low and ended up hiring Vic Fangio off of the Chicago Bears for yet another defensively minded head coach. From here, the Broncos got desperate for a franchise quarterback. They were looking high and looking low for their next quarterback, which was more than likely going to come from the 2019 draft class, but they also wanted a bridge quarterback to lead the new rookie. The result of this was trading for the Ravens quarterback Joe Flacco. The Ravens looked to trade Joe Flacco as they had a breakout young quarterback in Lamar Jackson, so trading Flacco, whose production was declining, made sense. They also ended up drafting a Missouri quarterback named Drew Lock in the 2nd round, 42nd overall, and in hindsight, this draft was one of the worst drafts to be looking for a quarterback in, with really the only relevant quarterback anymore being Kyler Murray from this draft class. The Broncos took who they thought was the best available option at 42 and rode with him, but it would come back to bite them in the butt. So how did the 2019 season go for the Broncos? Well, their rookie in Drew Lock suffered a thumb injury before the season even started, which sidelined him until week 12. During the season, they did improve, but they were still below 500, finishing at 7-9. Joe Flacco was the starter going into the season, and he played for 8 games, but suffered a season-ending neck injury in week 8, so it became Drew Lock's season in Denver. Lock became the starter when he returned from IR in week 12, and he performed moderately well. He had a 64.1 completion percentage and threw for 1,020 yards with 7 touchdowns to only 3 interceptions. Not bad for a rookie despite the small sample size, and things could only go up from there, right? In 2020, there was a lot going on from the COVID-19 pandemic, so this season is not much of a point of contention in my book. Things remain the same for the Broncos from a coaching and quarterback place, so let's just go ahead and dive into the numbers. The 2020 Broncos finished the season at 5-11, a huge step back for this team, but a lot of grace was given due to all the changes the pandemic implemented. Drew Lock also had a tough season, finishing the year with a 57.34 completion percentage, throwing for 2,933 yards and 16 touchdowns to 15 interceptions in the 13 games that he played. Not great numbers, but the season as a whole was a bit fluky, so let's go ahead and see what happened in 2021 before rushing to conclusions on Drew Lock. The 2021 Broncos ended up finishing at 7-10, so right about where they were in Drew Lock's first season, once again not where they wanted to be, still well below 500 and not even close to contending, but not so bad they were fighting for a top 5 pick in the draft. So how did Drew Lock perform? Well, he didn't even make it out of training camp as the starter, with Teddy Bridgewater, the newcomer to the team, being named the starter for the season. That being said, Lock only started 3 games while playing in 6 due to injuries to Teddy Bridgewater, and Lock's stats in these games, not good. He finished with a 60.36 completion percentage, throwing for 787 yards and 2 touchdowns to 2 interceptions. It was clear that a change of scenery was needed for Lock and the Broncos, as both sides were clearly done with each other at this point. The 2022 offseason was a big one for the Broncos. They were doing everything they could to try to get a new franchise quarterback into the building. This included the firing of Vic Fangio and the hiring of the Packers offensive coordinator Nathaniel Hackett to be their next head coach. The next step in building a contender? Find your next franchise quarterback, something the Broncos have been trying to do since Manning retired at the conclusion of the 2015 season. Their solution to this problem? Bringing in one of the better quarterbacks in the league who was somehow available for trade. The Broncos ended up making the infamous trade for the Seattle Seahawks star quarterback Russell Wilson. The details of this trade are as follows. In this trade, the Broncos gave up quarterback Drew Lock, tight end Noah Fant, defensive lineman Shelby Harris, 3 2022 draft picks, a first, a second, and a fifth rounder, which ended up being offensive tackle Charles Cross, outside linebacker Boye Mafe, and outside linebacker Tyreek Smith, and a 2023 first and second round pick, those turning into cornerback Devin Witherspoon and edge Derek Hall. In this trade, the Seahawks ended up giving up quarterback Russell Wilson and a 2022 fourth round pick, which turned into defensive lineman Ioma Uwazurike. This trade was meant to bring a new burst of life into a dying franchise. This move was applauded at the time, as it seemed like the Broncos finally, after 7 long years, had their guy to lead them once again to the promised land. So there they stood, the Denver Broncos facing the 2022 season with a new head coach and finally having a franchise quarterback. How did this season go for the Broncos? Well, fellow YouTuber Official Jaguar Gator 9 had to make 4 dumb decisions videos on Nathaniel Hackett in his 1 year as a head coach. For those of you who don't know, Official Jaguar Gator 9 makes incredible videos discussing everything NFL, from historical events surrounding the league to one of his bigger series, Dumb Decisions, where he discusses decisions that everyone knows are bad from the moment they're made. And a link to his channel will be down in the description below if you guys want to check him out. I highly recommend you do, and I highly recommend that you subscribe to him. Anyways, the 2022 Denver Broncos finished the season at 5-12 and without Nathaniel Hackett, who was fired mid-season. Another absolutely horrendous season for this team. This season was not only disastrous for the Broncos, but also Russell Wilson, who had a 60.46 completion percentage, only throwing for 3,524 yards and 16 touchdowns to 11 interceptions in the 15 games he played. These numbers are all significantly worse than his numbers in Seattle, especially the touchdown to interception ratio. That being said, many people gave Wilson some leeway as Nathaniel Hackett was a disaster, so the Broncos searched for yet another head coach while still keeping Russell Wilson as their quarterback. This search came to an end when the Saints traded Sean Payton and their 2024 fourth round pick to the Denver Broncos for a 2023 first round pick and a 2024 second round pick. This meant the Broncos sunk even more capital into this whole Russell Wilson experiment. But the Broncos had made the mistake in the 2022 offseason to immediately extend Wilson after trading for him, despite Wilson's contract having 2 years left on it. So the Broncos already had too much invested to let this experiment go to waste. Anyway, how has the Sean Payton era gone so far? Well, the Broncos currently sit at 7-8 after Week 16 with next to no chance of making the playoffs. How about Russell Wilson? How has he fared? Well, through 15 games, which is apparently now the end of his 2023 season, Wilson has a 66.44 completion percentage with 3,070 passing yards and 26 touchdowns to only 8 interceptions, significantly better than last season across the board. And Wilson seems to have revived his career, yet the Broncos have made a horrible decision surrounding him. By this point, it's no secret. The Denver Broncos have officially benched Russell Wilson for Jarrett Stidham. This decision tells everyone in the league that the Broncos are moving on from Russell Wilson this offseason. But why would they bench him and tell the league? Well, if Wilson were to get hurt in these last 2 games, the Broncos would owe Wilson another $37 million in guarantees due to an injury clause in Wilson's contract. Let's keep a pin in that because we will circle back to this here in a little bit. Anyways, why would the Broncos move on from Wilson after he revived his career? It's tough to say as the Broncos have so many other problems, but I am personally subscribed to the theory that Sean Payton wants his own quarterback to work with in Denver. He wasn't too keen on Wilson from the start, saying that he was not going to let anyone have any other personal trainers or anything like that at the start of the season because Wilson had his own personal trainer. That being said, there was also significant tension between the two during this whole tenure, this whole season. So it makes sense that Sean Payton wants to move on from Wilson and get his own guy in the building. And this poor season, paired with last season's failure, gives Sean Payton a valuable reason to justify moving on from Wilson, despite the numbers this season. Now, going back to Russell Wilson's injury clause, this is a huge point of contention as it led to a culture of massive toxicity that's brewing in Denver. The story is as follows. The Broncos asked Wilson to defer the guarantee date for the injury payout in the event that Wilson gets injured following Week 8's victory over the Kansas City Chiefs. But they did not just ask Russell Wilson, they demanded. They threatened Wilson with benching if he did not renegotiate his contract to alter the guarantees within that contract. They did not tell Wilson when he would be benched, but Wilson remained firm and did not alter his deal. This has led to Sean Payton announcing the benching earlier this week after the loss to the Patriots in Week 16, now that Payton finally had an excuse to bench Russell Wilson. Now, how has this led to a culture of toxicity, and how does this make them the most toxic franchise in the NFL? Well, let's go ahead and think about it. The Broncos have set a horrible precedent now that will drive all talent away from the team, and any future talent will not want to go to Denver. Think about it. If a star player thinks he could be benched for not altering his contract during the season, which both sides agreed to, by the way, why would the player want to sign there unless he is getting significantly overpaid, which I don't think the Broncos would want to do for the risk? That's right. They won't sign with the Broncos. No player wants to be in a toxic environment like that. So this decision could result in the Broncos setting themselves back another 5 to 7 years until this whole thing gets cleared up. Overall, it seems like since they won Super Bowl 50, the Broncos have had many opportunities to pull something together, but they have always found a way to botch the situation. From trading for Russell Wilson and getting Nathaniel Hackett as your head coach, to trading away Case Keenum for only a sixth, they have either passed on solid quarterbacks or just brought in the wrong head coach. This team has just been a train wreck, and it seems like there is no end in sight for this team. Trust me, I want to see the Broncos put things together. I want to see them get it together and get the job done. But it just does not seem like it can happen anytime soon after what's happened. Well, that's about going to do it for me today. This was my first video essay I've ever done, so please let me know down in the comments below your thoughts on how I did. Also, if you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing, because it does help with the channel a whole lot. And make sure you check out JaguarGator9, who is down in the description below. Also, if you haven't already, please go ahead and check out the video down here. It's one that YouTube thinks you will absolutely love. And with that, I will see you guys later. Peace out and have a good one.